Morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today's CaBA webinar on chalk stream restoration. If you don't know me, my name's Emily McCauley. I'm the Communications Assistant for Media and Events here at the Rivers Trust. I'll shortly be handing over to Alison Matthews, the Chalk Stream Restoration Programme Manager. But firstly, I'll just go over a few housekeeping points for today's webinar. Okay, so captions can be enabled for today's webinar and can be done so by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. You can edit the size of the subtitles by clicking more if you need to. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, and if you'd like to ask a question, then please use the Q&A function, which can also be found at the bottom of your screen. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. As an audience member, you won't be visible on screen, but this recording will be posted on the CaBA website afterwards. Okay, so that's all from me. I'll now ask Alison to come on and begin today's webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Great to see so many people joining us. This is a second of our TalkStream webinars. I'm hopefully going to share with you the agenda. Second of our TalkStream webinars, the first one was back in December, where we talked about the CaBA TalkStream strategy and introduced that. We'll put a link to that in the chat in case anybody who wasn't on that one wants to refresh their memory or go back and watch that. So hopefully you can see the agenda for this morning. So we've got some great speakers lined up for you. I'm going to hand over in a minute to David Sear to talk through the processes involved in making a chalk stream and what you need to know about those processes for river restoration. And then we're going to have a series of 3 talks from people who are actually really active in doing chalk stream restoration. And we've got good geographic coverage there. We're going from sort of Wessex up through Norfolk into Yorkshire. So it's great to have those people talking to us. And I'm just going to finish off with a little bit about the river restoration guide for chalk streams that we want to develop. And that's where we're going to need your help. So you get to sit back and listen to the talks to begin with, but then we're going to ask you a couple of questions towards the end. And on that theme, you may remember the last call, we did ask you a question at the start about where you'd come from. And Emily, if you could perhaps bring up the first question. We'd love to know a little bit about the people that join our webinars, just because it really helps us to plan future events, and it helps us when we're giving the presentations to know what sort of audience we've got too. So it would be great if you could just fill in the question there. Don't agonize over it for too long. And if one of those categories doesn't suit you, doesn't matter too much. And if, like me, you're not actually that involved in river restoration at the moment, that's absolutely fine too. We want to have people along, and we're just really keen to share with people what we're doing and get people involved. So I can't see at the moment, Emily, because my screen's doing something funny. But are we getting people filling that in?
Yeah, lots of people filling it in.
That's fabulous. So, Emily, if you could tell me when we've got a reasonable number of people that have filled that in and what the results are, because for some reason I've lost my screen. I can just see myself, which is never great.
Yeah, so we've got over 150 people putting in their polls, and they are kind of quite a lot at the moment is not actively involved in river restoration at the moment, and the same amount commissioning and or funding work. Not as many designing schemes or delivering schemes, but about 20% are designing. Well, it says designing and delivering schemes, about 20%. About
Okay.
5% are academic and 14 are regulator.
Oh, great. So we've got a good mixture of people here, which is what we were seeking to achieve. So that's great. And just a second poll quickly, please, Emily, which is just for those of you that are involved in delivering river restoration work. Again, we're really interested to make sure that we hit the right people that we're asking questions of and involving in our events. We'd just love to know a little bit about how long you've been involved in doing that for. Just to make sure we've got that good spread of people that we're talking to. Part of the work that I'm involved in with the CaBA Chalk Streams group is trying to reach out and build a community of people that are involved in all aspects of chalk stream restoration. So river restoration is obviously just one part of it. This webinar today is on that, but we're trying to involve people in what we do, so we make sure we're doing things that are relevant and meaningful to all of that community. So Emily, what are we learning from this one?
Fairly even across no experience, less than 1 year, and 5 to 10 years actually, and then less so for more than 10 years. But
Okay.
we've got about 170 people who's filled that in.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for doing that. That really helps. It shows us we've got a good mix of people. So I think we're ready to start now. So if I could hand over to David, you can see the agenda there. I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to David, and then I'll come back at the end. And then do remember to put your questions in the Q&A. And also, just in the interest of gathering information from you, we'd love to hear about any projects you're running. So I will put a link to a survey that we're running for projects that were delivered last year. We'd love to know a little bit about those. So I'm going to put a link to the survey in the chat. And also any feedback you've got about how you'd appreciate help for river restoration. Would you want to get some sort of guide or regular webinars or any ideas you've got? So whilst we're running through the presentations, feel free to put your ideas in the chat and we'll come back to those at the end. But at this point, I'll hand over to David. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Alison. Can I just check that you can see the screen?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, brilliant. Well, look, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to this. I'm going to be talking about chalkstream geomorphology and its implications for river restoration, which, as anyone who's clearly we've got an experienced audience here knows, that in itself is a lifetime's work. So bear with on this one. Chalkstream geomorphology then requires us to know something about the past, but before we look at the past, let's just look at the future, because what we restore today will have ramifications way into the future. And so what we can see here are a series of diagrams that essentially say we're going to get more intense flooding and rainfall events, we're going to get longer and deeper droughts, and we're going to get warmer stream temperatures. And that's under all scenarios for future climate change. The point being is that what we're experiencing in our past experience of chalk streams is actually very different to those that a teenager today will experience in their later lives. And we need to remember that. And I would submit that a key to mitigating some of these impacts is going to be improving the resilience of chalk streams to these and other pressures on them. And that's going to require restoration of appropriate physical habitat. So does geomorphology matter for restoration? These two figures basically give you two chalk streams. The one on the left is doing a brilliant job of on-site flood protection, but that's it. Whereas the one on the right is offering multiple benefits. And so if we can move our chalk streams where we can more towards the one on the right, we get multiple benefits: biodiversity, carbon storage, climate resilience, and off-site flood protection. So there's a very strong reason for doing this. It's good for nature, it's good for society. So let's start off by looking at how people like me think rivers work. Rivers are complex systems, and this is a complex diagram as a result, but essentially it boils down to a set of drivers that drive the system: water quantity, floods and droughts, the sediment load, both fine and coarse, but then there's the organic load, the wood, seeds and biota that interact and grow and change things. And then there's the water quality, the oxygen, temperature, nutrients, etc. These are influenced by the climate and also, of course, by things like water management and land management. These interact with existing conditions, the boundary conditions. The inherited valley topography is important. That gives us slope, for example, and the area available for the rivers to work within. You've got the bed and bank materials, the vegetation that enables the river to perhaps move laterally or not, and the ecosystem engineers. Beaver, for example, are back on the landscape. But alongside those is wood, vegetation, and of course, fish. These interact to produce a river floodplain habitat. We describe it in these terms: its cross-section form, its long profile, the sorts of things you would be interested in designing correctly as part of your scheme. The channel plan form, how many channels, the number of, how wiggly they are, to use a common term these days, and also the floodplain type. Now, these are a product of history and channel management. So this is how rivers work. And what it points out is this interconnectedness between different parts of our river catchment. Now, the interesting thing is look through, and I have restoration guidance and training, most of it is based on something called alluvial river concepts. This is important because it assumes that rivers can erode their bed and banks, they can move around in response to changing flows, and they have a dynamic bed load, creates pools and riffles and bars, and because of their movement around in their floodplain, they create oxbows and old channels. Trouble is, though, chalk's a bit different. So what makes it different? And I'll start with a misquote from James Carville. It's the geology, stupid. We need to remember that chalk streams are and flow over very specific geology in many cases. Chalk. Now, chalk is very dissolvable. It has layers of flint in it, which then becomes, over time, the gravel beds. And it produces a rolling, subdued topography, partly as a result of that ability to be dissolved rather than break up into chunks that last a long time. That's important because when you look at a map of chalk stream river networks, you can see that they're the ones in blue here, there's less river length per area compared to more impermeable catchments. That's really important because what it's telling us is that they're naturally less well connected to their catchment land surface. Also, because of that subdued topography, they have naturally low gradients. So as a result, natural chalk streams will have low fine sediment loads and, compared to other streams, limited power to move those sediments around. Chalk also has a massive influence on the hydrology. So this diagram here on the bottom is all about how much groundwater there is in the flow, and the vertical axis is how flashy, how variable is that flow. What we can see here is that the chalk streams, which are in white circles, are strongly groundwater dominated and have relatively low flashiness, which means they have naturally low peak discharge. That's important because discharge is one of the components of stream power. So they have naturally low stream powers, unless they're covered by other sediments. And the map on the right, thanks very much to CEH and Alison, shows the base flow index, that's the lower axis, mapped across our chalk streams. And you can see that anything that's dark blue has a really strong groundwater dominance, and anything that's sort of orangey is more impermeable. So the message here is know your chalk stream and know its hydrology, because you might have a flashy headwater, and you might have a groundwater dominated lower course. We mustn't forget as well that part of the chalk control is on the intermittency, and a significant proportion of our chalk river networks then are intermittent streams. These contribute to low, naturally low sediment yields. They have their own geomorphology and ecology, and speaking as a geomorphologist, they're poorly understood. But we know that the flows beneath the bed are really, really vital. But I'll be the first to say we need to know much more about these. Talking about the flow beneath the bed, in groundwater rivers, the hyporheic zone, as it's called, that's the zone where groundwater and surface water interact, is really, really important. It's important both down the river, but it's important across the floodplain. The top left graph there shows lots of arrows interacting and a sense of a change in that flow regime. Immediately around the channel, you've got that hyporheic zone where the surface water and groundwater interact. But diagrams at the bottom remind us that actually the geomorphology, the physical features, also have a role in forcing variations in those hyporheic processes. And they're important because there is a whole ecology that is associated with the inter-gravel and inter-sediment flows. And that's something, again, that we need to bear in mind when, just digging a river across a floodplain, for example. We haven't probably thought about this hyporheic. And then finally, chalk streams grow their own sediments. It's called tufa. And again, we don't know that much about tufa, but in some streams, like the Lincolnshire chalk streams there, it's so effective in depositing in the riverbed that it can form actual barriers and geomorphology. Whereas down in the River Test, down near where I live, for example, tufa forms great beds within the floodplain. So tufa is important because It's low density, so when it breaks up, it does form a coarse bed load. It can grow and compact the beds, and it may, and we don't know what it will do at this stage, but it may change with climate because chemical reactions that are required to produce tufa always increase with higher temperatures. But the other important thing to realise with chalk streams is that they have a history and that we are uniquely in chalk streams dependent on that history. The story of a chalk stream starts in the glacial periods, for example, where dynamic processes, braided, active gravel bed rivers were present in the bottom of the valleys as a result of the landscape being frozen. So that's the source of the chalk riverbed gravels. As the temperature warmed out of the last glaciation, and do remember there've been multiple glaciations, so that's, what we have is a sandwich, a layer cake of sediments in our valleys. As the temperature warmed, vegetation came back in, peat began to grow, and many of our chalk river floodplains are bounded by peat and indeed underlain by peat. That confined those braided channels into multiple, probably multi-channel anastomosing systems, but over time, peat infilled those. We farmed the landscape, we released the fines into the system over the last 6,000 years, and we again filled in those multiple channels so that today most of our natural chalk streams would have single thread meandering channels as a result of that history. So if we begin to put these together, we've got a model for chalk streams that have stable banks, fossil gravel beds, and low stream power. And what that means is that in terms of our river geomorphology, they are fairly inactive systems. They have immobile beds over which mobile sands and silts coming from the catchment move over those and into those. They're sensitive to small increases in fine sediment. They don't naturally adjust their planform or bed levels, which means what we do to them will stay for a long time, and what we've inherited won't change particularly itself. But they are, as a result, uniquely dependent on biological processes. They are not, strictly speaking, alluvial rivers. So the biological processes, really important. So large wood, very, very important in all rivers, but chalk rivers in particular, they're going to be important if they're there, if there's a source. Log jams connect the floodplain. Vegetation can interact with fines to change channel widths, for example. Invertebrates like crayfish can increase locally the fine sediments through bank burrowing, but also can flush the bed, as can fish. Their spawning and foraging habitat can remove the fines from the bed year on year. And then, of course, there's beaver. And as restoration practitioners and scientists, we absolutely need to figure out how best we can work with these biological communities. Very recent examples from last week for me. Here's a river, a chalk river that's naturally restoring sinuosity through fine sediment, interacting with vegetation to create bars and narrowing the width there. This took 10 years approximately, and it needs fine sediment and vegetation. The single flood generated a wood-forced riffle bar pool habitat in one day. So these processes operate quite rapidly or over relatively long time periods. We have to remember those when we're thinking about what we might restore to and how long it's going to take. So what do natural chalk streams look like? Very stable, single thread meandering rivers, but may have multiple channels where there's local blockages, either beaver dams, log jams, or vegetation. Channel morphology then will be locally forced. You won't get a pull riffle sequence evolving in most chalk streams just by sediment transport. It requires obstacles. It requires trapping of mobile fine sediment in order to force those changes. Interestingly, as we move into an era of floodplain restoration, floodplain processes are going to vary depending on how confined your valley is, whether it's an intermittent or not. But we shouldn't expect the classic oxbows or floodplain channels unless there's been some substantial blockage over a long period of time to force it. Most of them will be infilled from the very, very distant past, and we haven't got the processes to cut new ones. Groundwater wetlands, on the other hand, are going to be really, really important. And I think that's one of the messages. Groundwater wetland and understanding your wetlands on your floodplains, what should be there versus what can be sustained, is going to be really important to consider. And then, of course, on the floodplain, vegetation and beaver-mediated complexity is what a natural chalk stream almost certainly was dominated by. Finally, coming in and thinking about the catchment. Those fine sediments, they're really, really important both for building morphology, but excess fine sediments, we know, have an ecological impact. What we do, like overwiggling or increasing complexity in the river channel, reduces that stream power, and in the presence of our excess fine sediment load, may force changes that we don't really want. And these fine sediment impacts can take many, many years to emerge. On the river restoration RRP site, for example, which was done 28 years ago, it went through a phase of looking like a gravel bed stream for about 10 years. But now, with increased complexity from trees, it's filling up with fines. So we have to be very careful with what we're doing and thinking about the wider pressures. So the quote from Marcus Aurelius, or was it Russell Crowe? What we restore in life echoes in eternity. We need to get our designs relevant for the future and relevant for the processes that we have in our system. So take care, understand your system before designing and modifying it. We're very good these days with LiDAR, etc., and field surveys and all the rest of it, of listing features and mapping features in detail. But that's different to understanding what they mean. So getting to understand your system before restoring it is vitally important. And one of the examples of that is that rivers are connected. So our restoration projects, though delivered at a reach scale, need to really consider that connectivity. So I would submit that start with a catchment strategy, and if necessary, take the time to make your river restoration ready. That might mean reducing fine sediments. It might mean reducing pollution first. It may mean growing your wood supply where you haven't got it. But the please do nots would mean, please don't assume alluvial river channel morphology. Pools and riffles form through local processes in chalk streams, not general processes of bed movement. Don't forget climate change and its implications. Is your restoration design going to be proof against warming temperatures? And don't start with the fashionable actions, the stage zeros, the rewigglings, the floodplain pools, without thinking about whether they are appropriate for your river and for the processes you've got and for the future that you're moving into. Because ultimately, surely this is the goal. We're not restoring the past, we're restoring to a system that can be self-sustaining into the future, whilst delivering this range of benefits for society. And I think with that, I'll pass on to Charles Rangeley-Wilson. Thank you.
Hi there. Hope you can hear me. Could someone, Emily, or someone just say I'm on the screen?
Yep, you're there.
Great. And I'm just going to start sharing. But yeah, thank you, David. That was really, really interesting. I'm going to sort of talk, hopefully following on from David, but just to emphasize, I chat to David a lot, and I try and sort of incorporate what I learned from those chats, the science, into my thinking about chalk stream restoration. But what I'm going to talk about today is the sort of interface between the sort of stuff David's talking about and then its practical application and how you turn some of those ideas into river designs. So this opening image, for example, which is a lovely picture by Charlie Hamilton James when he was taking some shots for National Geographic last year, that river on the right there, snaking up with the swans on it, that is actually only 2 or 3 years old. So how do you get to that? Why do you get to that? So I think it's really, really important to understand the evolution of chalk streams across time. David spoke a little bit about it, but in my view, practical restoration should be built on a really good understanding of the natural state of the stream and the catchment, the ways in which these have been modified, and the relative impact of those modifications. And that will vary. David said, know your chalk stream. There are green sand chalk streams with higher base flows. There's the really high, with lower base flows, sorry, the really high base flows like the Test and Itchen. They all are very different geomorphologically. The East Anglian and Lincolnshire and Yorkshire streams are different from those in Wessex, and they'll vary as you go down the river. So you really need to think carefully about what the natural state is that you're actually trying to restore, and the history of the modifications and the impact. So spent a bit of time last week trying to really illustrate, because I think this is really, really key to get into your mind's eye the degree to which chalk streams have been modified and the ways. So again, David had a slide that was related to this. So, the ice retreats, you've got melting meltwater coming across these sort of alluvial plains, probably cutting multiple channels. Over time, the world warms, and gradually the multiple channels fill in and the floodplain accretes with peat, and that locks your river into probably one main channel, maybe some ephemeral channels. The differences between here, this date 6000, which is my guess, but David said it's about right. It's important to realize that we were already modifying chalk streams by the Middle Ages. So can you see that there's a significant change there? And that's because we had introduced milling. And to introduce milling is a very, very significant morphological impact on the river, because you have to divert the chalk stream to the edge of the floodplain to build up the head of water to drive the mill. And when you do that, you impact the gradient. And when you impact the gradient, you impact all of the river processes. I've added some water meadows for the 18th century, but the really, really significant changes there are reflected in the 20th century image, where to the water meadows and the mill diversions and the canalization that was all very much in place before the 20th century, we've added very, very intense ditching, changes in the way the landscape is managed, much more arable land in a chalk landscape, which increases sediment runoff. And the other key difference there is the dredging. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it's a very, very significant impact. So what fundamentally has changed? So we've changed our rivers from a steady slope to a staircase. That's a very, very significant impact on the way in which the sediment washes down the stream and accretes in the stream. We've changed their sinuosity, generally from a meandering line to a straight line. I've got some maps that will illustrate the degree to which that has happened. Channel cross-section, generally from wide and shallow to deep and incised, somewhat trapped within canalized, incised dredge channels. The connection between the stream and the floodplain has gone from seamless back in, pre-Roman era to almost non-existent nowadays. Chalk streams are trapped inside their channels by the ways in which we've modified them. And the sediment supply and sediment deposition has gone from very, very minimal to absolutely enormous. And that has very significant impact. So just a few slides to illustrate how this goes. So milling, it's an amazing fact that there were over 5,000 mills already by the time William the Conqueror invaded. There's a lovely paper on it from, I think, the 1940s. And many, many of them were on chalk streams. But because chalk streams are quite malleable rivers, you could afford to build the Roman mill on chalk streams. And the Roman mill is the one pictured here in the painting by Constable, is a vertical mill wheel with a gearing inside, which depends on completely blocking the river. And in order to get them to work, you take the river off to the edge of the floodplain and you build up the head of water to drop water over the mill wheel. So that has a very significant impact. And in this cross section down here on the bottom left, you can see that the former river is marked there with a little red dot, and the mill leat is over here behind a raised bank. And that's a very, very significant impact on the rivers. And most chalk streams, or many chalk streams, were at mill saturation point by the early Middle Ages, and certainly by the 17th or 18th century. Rivers like the Wye and High Wycombe, you couldn't actually fit any more mills in. They're a staircase. The Wensum has something like 25 meters of fall between the source and Norwich, and 22 or 23 meters of that fall is used up by mills. Then we canalized our rivers. The blue line there is a map drawn by Fadden in Norfolk, 1797, or Faden, and the red line is only 100 years later. That's from the very first edition Ordnance Survey. So we had a very, very significant canalizing impact took place through the 19th century all over Norfolk, and no doubt all over the chalk stream area. And to that, we have then added ditching and drainage. The top map on the right-hand side is drawn from the Babingley catchment pre-18th century. And the bottom map is the centre of the River Babingley catchment from the middle of the 20th century. Now think about that map David showed you of the drainage network of chalk streams, which is very, very sparse, but we have added immeasurably to it. Now, we haven't even drawn roads on that, roads and tracks, but if you then add roads and tracks to that ditched network, you'll see that we've massively increased the sediment supply to our chalk streams. And then finally, we've radically dredged them. And that is the most significant impact of all, in my view. It makes everything much worse. We've removed their gravel beds. It compromises their gradient because the dredging was rarely done the whole way down. There are always interruptions under power lines, under bridges, etc. And it's massively reduced connectivity to the floodplain. And it has also allowed the ditches to be dug deeper through the post-war period, because obviously you're draining your landscape to a lower drainage point. So what makes good restoration? Well, in my view, it must be reversing these fundamental underlying physical changes. So restoring the natural slope where it has been compromised, restoring the natural plan form where it's been compromised, because the natural plan form gives you all sorts of interesting dynamic processes, restoring the natural cross-section of the channel, restoring the connection of the floodplain, of the river to the floodplain, and attenuating sediment and runoff wherever possible from the wider landscape. Although know from experience, that's not like nailing a cloud to a door, but it must be done, and we must keep on trying to do it. And you do all of those things so that natural processes are unshackled and can take over. But this, in all my experience of doing river restoration, which isn't as much as some, but I've been sort of, involved in it over quite a few years, the hidden dimension, the most important one of all, and the one we kind of don't really see, is the stream bed level, and especially the stream bed level to the floodplain ratio. Because if the stream is in the right place in the floodplain, i.e. in its natural low point, and the bed level is restored so that the stream bed and the floodplain are in a kind of correct ratio, the rest will very largely take care of itself over time, i.e. the river can use vegetation to self-adjust, but only if the riverbed and the floodplain are in the correct alignment. On the other hand, if you don't do that, no matter what else you do, if you don't sort those things out, in my view, the restoration ultimately won't work. And I've got a few examples of that. So, for example, some people might recognize this. It's the Candover. No, it's not. It's the Titchbourne in Hampshire, the southernmost tributary of the Upper Itchen. And it didn't need anything other than grazing, relief of grazing pressure. The picture on the left I took in 2005, picture on the right I took a couple of years ago from the same flyover. Back in 2005, that was a very heavily grazed field. It isn't anymore, but the stream bed is in the correct alignment. It hasn't been dredged, and it has done a very, very fine job of sorting itself out. Conversely, this river in Norfolk has been diverted to the edges of the floodplain. See the picture on the right-hand side. You see the arrows. That marks the direction of the diversions. It's also been impounded because it's being used to build up the head of water to drive a mill. And then in the post-war years, it was also, to add insult to injury, it was dredged. And consequently, it's over deep, silty, sluggish, and choked with burreed. Now, neither hurdles and pinch points fixed it, nor top right, same image, did dig and dump, the shoulder and berm technique, because they didn't fix the underlying physical compromises. So the stream was a sediment trap. Large woody debris didn't really help either. Yes, it caught the sediment at the edges, but the channel still remained massively over deep and isolated from the floodplain. So what we needed to do here, was to address the underlying issue, which is the diversion, the impoundment, and the dredging, and fundamentally to give the stream, to put the stream back in the part of the floodplain it wants to be, and to give it back a gravel riverbed. And that did address the problems, and that stream is looking fabulous now, several years after the restoration, clean gravelled and flowing well. So some more examples. Looking at the time, I've got to get a skip on. Another example of a dredged channel here on the left. And in these examples, by the way, I am using examples of projects that I've been involved in. And I think it's really, really important to go back and look with a critical eye at what you've done, and take a sort of honest assessment and think, well, was that good, or wasn't it? And so I was involved in some of these restorations. This one, 2012, I was a bit skeptical about it, but nevertheless, let's see what happened. 2012, a sort of shoulder and berm type project, but the underlying problem remained, as you can see, with all the burr reed choking the channel several years later. So we had another go, but this time, learning from our mistakes, we raised the bed level to the true gradient line throughout the entire reach. So the question then, how sustainable is that? Well, 5 or 6 years later, it's still working. It's still functioning as a chalk stream, nice clear gravel, all the weeds, etc. Another example, more recent project, the River Stiffkey in Norfolk, very, very highly canalised stream. It was restored many years ago, or a small project was done on it many years ago with gravel bars. And these look okay at the gravel bar, but they don't address the underlying issues. And so between the gravel bar, it is like an upside down green scrubbing brush all summer long. It is so choked with burr reed because, of course, it is a silt trap. So again, what you've got to do is you've got to investigate what the fundamental underlying issues are, which you can see in the map on the left, sort of canalization, extreme canalization, the relic channelization mills and impoundments and so on. And then you've got to do some investigative work into what was formerly there. And I actually worked with David Sear and Imi Speck on this. They were very, very helpful at Southampton in sort of investigating the sort of former natural conditions. You design it. One of the things I think with designs is to break these complex ideas down into quite simple and deliverable kind of formulas, because when you're working in the landscape with diggers, everything gets complicated. Then you've got to construct it, allow the river room to self-determine within the natural channel, but carving the natural channel dimensions based on all the empirical data that you've managed to gather, and then allowing that self-adjustment to take place. But because here we've addressed the fundamental issues of gradient and canalization, floodplain, cross-section of channel, etc., the river looks like a chalk stream should. So in short, work out what the natural stream would have looked like, address the underlying physical constraints so that we can make eco-engineers great again. And this is one for David, but it's very, very important. It was a term I came across from David several years ago, but the more I look at rivers, the more I think about it, the more I see the degree to which trees, plants, and animals are the things that give your river the healthy dynamic processes over time. And most importantly, and going back all the way to David's original point, that way you get self-sustaining, resilient chalk streams and floodplains through winter, through summer, and hopefully into an uncertain future. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over now to Mike Blackmore.
Thanks, Charles. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully this will work. It's just okay. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, we can see it, Mike.
Great. So I'm going to try in about 15 minutes to run through how to apply large-scale chalkstream restoration principles at individual project scales, and how those principles can help you to overcome local constraints. And I'm going to try and do that by looking at large whole river scale and individual reach scale projects. So at Wessex Rivers Trust, we're currently working on 2 landscape recovery projects on the River Wylye in Wiltshire and the River Allen in Dorset. In total, that's over 40 kilometres of river. In the case of the Allen, it's the entire length of that river. Now, the whole idea of landscape recovery is to be bold and ambitious. But of course, each scheme includes over 20 different landowners. So that's 20 different sets of interests, concerns, and aspirations, 20 separate business models, 20 different perspectives on what the river should be and what it should do. So how do you go around building a coherent, bold, and yet deliverable restoration strategy when you've got so many different and sometimes even contradictory constraints to work with? Well, we figured the only way to really do that was to actually start at the finish line. So to start with an evidence-based vision of a fully restored chalkstream valley. So in other words, a final restoration strategy. And that would have the ultimate goal of restoring the river and the floodplain to its fully natural state one day. And considering on these projects, we've got main roads, railway lines, some enormous old gravel pits, in the case of the Allen, a town in the way of that happening, you know, that one day is realistically some way off. But so long as we can get all the landowners involved to agree to 2 simple principles, one, that from a purely ecological perspective, the best thing for the river is to be returned to a completely natural state. And 2, that even the biggest man-made constraints, no matter how persistent, are nonetheless, in the grand scheme of things, still temporary. If we can get that mindset in place, then actually we only need to identify logical, practical, and scalable, ultimately achievable steps along the journey towards that finish line. And what we've realized is that those steps don't need to be sequential. We just need to provide options that help landowners initiate progress towards a shared goal and allow them to do so according to their own constraints, their own ambitions, their own finances, and actually also within their own timeframes. So, as mentioned, we're aiming for the boldest possible vision that's truly long-term in its outlook, the vision of a naturally functioning river fully connected to its floodplain. The idea is this is a strategy that won't ever need rewriting because it takes you all the way to the finish line. There's a nice clear end goal, even if it's, you know, currently unachievable, and just acknowledging that we don't need to achieve it now or even necessarily in 100 years. We just need to always be moving towards it. And one of the most important aspects is that nothing we propose should need to be undone in order for the next more ambitious step to be taken. We don't want to be doing things that, in order for us to then take the next big leap, we have to kind of wipe that clean and start again. Everything needs to be a step on the journey. Our approach has been to sort restoration opportunities into different grades. So the higher the grade here, the more significant the intervention, with grade 5 interventions being the most ambitious, but potentially the most difficult. and grade 1 being the simplest, but not necessarily the least impactful. In some cases, a bit like Charles showed us then, a grade 1 intervention might be all that's needed to put the icing on the ecological cake. So regardless of the other options, a big part of the program are these simple grade 1 changes. In a lot of cases, these are actually in the catchment away from the river, and these are the sort of changes that will reduce sediment and water quality impacts. Grade 2 is what we've previously called river restoration. So things like woody debris work, in some cases even weir and sluice removal. Any project that improves the channel makes a significant improvement, but it's not necessarily fixing the underlying issues, like, for example, a river having been moved or being really severely dredged. Grade 3, these options are all about re-wetting the floodplain, so things like bund removal, ditch blocking. In some cases on the chalk streams, we can look at partial reconnection of the historic water meadow system. And grade 4, what we're calling river restoration here, is the full or true river restoration option. So putting the river back in the valley bottom, anything that's fully undoing those historic channel modifications. And then finally, our grade 5 options are essentially grade 4 on steroids. So restoring the whole floodplain to a pre-water meadow condition, or as near as we can get. So the grade 5 options don't necessarily need to be feasible in the short or medium term. They may require currently unfeasible changes to infrastructure. Like I've said, roads, rail, all that kind of stuff that might actually be in the way of that happening. And the steps can be considered as steps along the journey. But as I said, they're not necessarily sequential. We're not putting any obligation on anyone to progress along this journey to a level of intervention that's beyond what they're currently comfortable with, so long as that long-term goal stays in place. Now, one of the more unique challenges on the southern chalk streams are this legacy of the water meadows. So the 17th and 18th century water meadow and mill network was so vast that in some cases, almost every square inch of floodplain that could be made into water meadow was. And this means it can be quite difficult sometimes to find the original paleo channels that would have once threaded the floodplain. Sometimes LiDAR data just picks up more water meadow. This already very heavily modified floodplain was further denaturalized in the post-war land drainage era. Floodplains were converted to farmland wholesale, and rivers all over the country actually were dredged, straightened and widened. The idea to get the water off the land and out to sea as quickly as possible. Now, most of the rivers in England would, after this, to at least some degree, heal themselves because they had the sediment transport and the morphology and the flow energy to do that. But for a lot of the kind of low energy, low gradient, low sediment chalk streams, that change has been as good as permanent. So how do we go about building restoration strategies and designs in such a dramatically altered landscape? Well, we've started, first of all, by looking at what's already been done. So having a look at previous studies. We've looked at what data is already available, of which we have more of and better access to than ever before, particularly through modern GIS systems. We've looked back at historical maps to see what clues might be missing from that contemporary data. David's on the call, so those contemporary data. We've also undertaken walkovers to ground truth the data and add our own observations, assessments, and to start mapping out opportunities. So some of this is desk-based, some of this is mapped out in real time in the field. And the more we learn, the more it evolves. So it's something that's dynamic and malleable, but ultimately still evidence-led. So little example here, looking at the satellite imagery, you can see that there's something interesting going on in this kind of brown patch here. Looking at the LiDAR, we can see that this is part of a historic paleo channel and likely the original course of the river. But even with the LiDAR, we're clearly missing a big part of the story. So overlaying historic maps over that, we can actually see the rest of the channel. And here, actually, that's indicated by the old parish boundary, which is the dotted line. And looking at those two together, we can actually see that further upstream, there are some other little paleo kind of channels that aren't showing up on the LiDAR, but that the old maps picks up. So just to demonstrate how our field-based surveys are working, here we've got some of the opportunities we've observed on site. So we have polygons showing potential for wetland creation, lines picking out old paleo channel features. And then we have points that highlight other observations, potential constraints, that kind of thing. And having mapped all of this out and done that kind of detective work, we produce this final output, which is, in our case, is a kind of river restoration dashboard. And we can filter this by our grade system. We can filter it by landowner. We can toggle satellite imagery, LiDAR, old map data. We can actually draw instant cross sections across the floodplain. And this is a really great tool to engage with the landowners and start talking about what kind of options they want to consider. What level of restoration are they willing to go for at this stage, and how that ties in with their neighbours upstream and downstream, how that fits into the big picture. And we can do this usually sat in their own kitchens. So far, this is working as a really good tool. But restoration at this scale is rare. The opportunity is rare, and actually having an opportunity to have this level of joined up thinking between landowners like you have with a landscape recovery scheme is even rarer. Let's take the river test for an example. A few years ago, we did some sums and worked out that fishing on the test is worth about 50 grand per kilometre, even in a heavily degraded condition. And it's generating about £270 of profit per farmed trout that is chucked in there. So let's imagine that's your business and some NGO comes along and asks you to let them do something like this to it. And let's say that may result, for argument's sake, in a loss of 1/3 of the guaranteed, you pays your money, you get your fish, easy casting. Well, that might not necessarily be the most tantalizing business proposition you've heard that year. So where does all this lofty, evidence-led, grand vision fit in a catchment like this? Well, perhaps we can't talk about it in the same way. Perhaps individual projects are going to be smaller, they're going to be more bespoke to individual landowners' needs. Perhaps the options we need to present are focused in on what might seem like tiny details. We also might come across issues like protected species, such as water voles, that prevent you from delivering an ideal project. In those cases, whether it's the intricacies of land use, fisheries, or even ecological constraints, it still pays to develop multiple options to progress the river towards a final restoration. And again, don't prevent additional steps on the journey from being taken in the future. So you may end up with something that's a little bit more complicated than what you anticipated, but bespoke beats off the shelf every time. Landowners' attitudes and even water voles move on. Don't be afraid to design in things that you can't deliver yet. This is a section of the river test that was in a really dreadful state. So artificially straightened and widened that all morphology had effectively halted. In some respects, it was a nice blank canvas for a fairly straightforward restoration. However, the Fire Riverbank here is owned by the couple in this house, who, having first said they were completely on board, at the last minute decided they would only proceed if the view from the window where they do their washing up remained completely unchanged. So at this stage, applications were in, the procurement was underway, we were gearing up for delivery. So disaster, yeah? Well, because the design was based on principles and processes rather than products and techniques, and because we were operating this kind of flexible options-based approach, it was actually possible in this case to redesign the project so that the most dramatic changes were obscured by summer tree and vegetation cover. So we could slightly redesign the plan form while keeping to our methodology, keeping to the same bill of quantities, working around water voles, and actually staying within the text, if not necessarily the drawings of the original FRAP application. The project was still really transformative. It achieved the kind of outcomes we were hoping for. So appropriate channel dimensions, restored sediment transport, self-cleaning riverbed capable of supporting classic chalk stream macrophytes, providing good spawning habitat, all of that good stuff. Another river test example, landowners weren't happy with our plans to basically chuck a load of trees in the river. They thought it was far too untidy. So instead, we designed ways to create that same fallen tree woody habitat that, at least when it was installed, looked a lot neater. End result really made no difference. We also built in hard standing areas, which were essentially the upstream end of a load of trees buried in gravel, which would act as places where anglers could still cast and land fish. And really, is it any different a few years later than if we had just gone and chucked some trees in there? No, not really. So again, multiple options to deliver the same outcome based on the same principles. So the end result was essentially no different than if we had chucked in a load of trees as planned. Restored marginal habitat, remeandered channel form, and improved drought resilience. So the principles and the aims remain the same, and the constraints of the project simply gave rise to a different way of achieving them. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing there, and I'm handing over, I assume, to John next. John's ready?
Yep. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks.
Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, we can see that, John.
Okay. So I'm going to focus in on a specific site, picking up quite a lot of the threads that have been talked about previously in the previous talks. I'm the Living Landscapes Manager for Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and I cover the Wolds and Holderness area of East Yorkshire, at which we have the northern chalk streams that predominantly flow into the River Hull catchment, which flows down into the Humber estuary, but there are also a few smaller chalk streams flowing in different directions off the Yorkshire Wolds and don't actually interact with the River Hull, but I'm going to focus on the River Hull today. So Driffield Trout Stream, or Driffield Beck as some people refer to it, is where we're going to focus. And just to give you that sort of location, there's Yorkshire, with the river network, and you can see on the right hand edge of the screen here, you've got the River Hull catchment flowing down to Kingston upon Hull, and the Yorkshire Wolds just on the west side of the river catchment there. And focusing in further, here is the River Hull headwater chalk streams, and these are streams that we've been working on for a number of years in partnership with a lot of people. But the slideshow I'm just about to go into actually highlights and picks up that message around having a wider, longer term view, but recognizing to get there, you sometimes have to take those small steps and interim steps, and it won't all happen at once. And recognizing where your opportunities are at the time without stopping you having that bigger vision. So this is the Driffield trout stream, and as mentioned in a couple of the previous talks, like a lot of the streams, it was straightened, and that was for a mill downstream. And if you look at that map, you sort of look at it and go, most of the available habitat restoration opportunities are lost. Particularly on the eastern side, you'll see we've got Driffield Golf Course, and that has been quite a big constraint in terms of some of the conversations. But this is owned by one landowner, so we actually do have the benefit of not having to deal with a lot of landowners, all with competing priorities. You'll also see at the upstream end, so the bottom left of the slide is the upstream end. You'll see there is actually some of the historic feature there. And then if we look at the old mapping, you'll be able to see the meandering channel winding its way through that landscape with the straightened channel running through the middle there, where they wanted to take the water as quickly as possible down to the mill. So we recognised we had opportunity to look at the grand vision and to look at the full restoration, but the landowner in question wasn't ready to have that conversation, and that's about understanding and knowing your landowner and working with them on the journey. So we had to tread carefully about what we wanted to do and recognise that this was going to be a step process. So the area that is highlighted, that was highlighted in the OS map, is the area we recognise was probably the first bite of the cherry, bite of trying to do some restoration. In this area, we'd identified from site walkovers that the actual old stream channel was still intact. It's not particularly obvious on this LiDAR, but if you look at the bottom left again, bear in mind that picture at the bottom left of the screen here, because that comes up right at the end of this talk, and that sort of takes us into the grander vision. We've also had to recognise the constraint that some of the meandering channel on the southern boundary is not going to be an option currently because we've got the golf course and the constraints there. So it's about picking where you want to start your work. But to get to this orange area that we've got here, we actually needed to bring that landowner on a journey and encourage them to understand that the stream wasn't functioning as it should be, and that changes could be made to improve the overall stream sort of geomorphology and its intrinsic value, not just for the wildlife, but for the people using it, because this is, like a lot of the streams, it is fished, and the fishing club obviously needs to be involved in that conversation and on the journey as well. So we'll go back to this slide's 2015-16, but actually the conversation started in about 2013-14. So we're obviously 10-12 years on that journey now, and you'll see the dead straight channel, and you'll see that we're doing some works, but they are small scale in channel improvements, and they're not intrinsically changing the bigger picture that we want to actually achieve. but it's taking that landowner on a journey that actually makes them comfortable with what we're trying to do and makes them understand that things are possible. This section, we have got quite limited ability to do a lot because where the Land Rover is parked is right on the edge of the golf course. But you'll see from this, it's over deepened, it's dead straight channel, and this section is lower down the system from the LiDAR map, and we're not ready to make those huge leaps and changes on this section. And picking up Mike's point, this may be a long journey way beyond my time working on the chalk stream, but it's actually not closing the door to that opportunity. It's allowing that conversation to stay live. So then, having done those works, we continued to stay in touch with the landowners and the fishing club, and we started to have the conversations with them about the what ifs. What if we looked at something a bit more aspirational and a bit more game changing? This aerial is the area that I showed a few slides ago in the orange block, the blocked out area, and this is looking upstream. And you can see the dead straight channel. You can see a path along the western side of the left-hand side of this image. That's where the access for the fishing was, and just to the other side of that tree line on the left-hand side is the golf course. But hopefully you can just start to pick out, if you get your eye in, on the right-hand side, there is a faint line running through that woodland canopy. That is the old channel. It's been lost in that it's been not had water down it for since the mill straightening happened, so over 120, 130 years. But it's still there. It's not actually been dug out. It's not been filled in. It's got a lot of organic matter collected in those years, but it's still there as a feature. So this next image just very crudely puts that image, that line back on. So you can sort of see, if you go back to that and then do that, so you can see where the old channel course was. And that was the start of the conversation, saying to them, well, what if we looked at this? Would you be interested in actually going on this journey with us? And they were initially very much like, can we actually do this? Is this something we can achieve? And we said, yeah, definitely. It's definitely something we should be looking at and actually drawing up plans to do. So we started, as I say, in 2019, and we actually had to do a whole host of willow clearing to actually open up the canopy and be able to get in with machines to actually allow that lost channel to be rediscovered. And this is that first phase. So you can see we're looking downstream on this image, and you can see that there is a definite channel starting to show itself there in this lost landscape. So this was the first phase of works, and we actually deliberately phased this works because this landowner was new to the bigger sort of aspirational work we were trying to do, and it was key to actually keep him on board and not actually make him have second thoughts or change his mind or say, no, I don't want to do any more. So the end of the first phase actually just created a backwater. So you can see that in the front of this picture is the original straightened channel running off upstream, off to the left-hand side of this image. And if you look straight ahead on that, the middle to the right of that picture, you can see the meandering channel, newly formed, going off up behind that willow line, but it actually only goes halfway up there, and it is effectively a backwater. We'd picked up a couple of springs, so it's actually bringing water out of the groundwater on the spring line, so it is self-feeding as well, but it's not fully connected at the upstream end. So in 2020, we then decided to continue upstream. So this is the upstream end, upstream of where that last image was taken. And it was important from a sort of design principles to actually try and retain as much as we could. And interestingly, once we took the willow out, and then we'd had a full year of the light getting into this site, you could actually start to see the wetland plants reappearing. All they needed was that light and the growing conditions. So we actually retained as much of the wetland vegetation as we could in the next phase of works. And you can see the line of the white posts is the intrinsic line for the machine driver, so that he can actually see where he's heading. So we're not actually, we're giving him a nice simplistic way of working and not over complicating it for him. And this was actually a phase to get the full length of the channel reinstated, but not do the final connection. So we wanted to look at the bed levels, we wanted to look at the amount of springs coming out of this section. So again, it was phased to keep that landowner on board. And this is the aerial of that stage 2. And you can now see, looking upstream, the dead straight channel on the left-hand side, the planned new channel on the right-hand side, still very raw, still lots of engineering to finish off. And you'll also see the land bridges are still in, because we actually had to get machinery backwards and forwards. So it's effectively a disconnected backwater with the channel. But that gave the landowner time to understand and visit and come and look at it and see it in different weather conditions, see different flow conditions. When the straightened channel had full flow, what was the new channel doing in terms of groundwater? So we then moved on to stage 3. And so this was the connection. And on the right-hand side of the picture, you'll see the straightened channel just to the right of the machine. The left-hand side is the actual now connected channel. And this section here was one of the bits of work we needed to do to actually recreate the bank to disconnect the straightened channel from its straightened course and push the water down the new meandering channel. So we've got plastic piles in, effectively a bit like a coffer dam, preventing the flows. We've got clay backfill, and this is just working to actually create that new structure and keep the water flowing down the new channel. And then this is nearing completion, just making sure that we've got green engineering in place, where we think we might have erosion till it greens up. This was obviously a key moment for the landowner to actually see this taking shape. So we decided we'd get this final aerial to show him, and you can see now the meander channel this is looking downstream, and you've got the straightened channel and the meandering channel for comparison. And we then decided we'd make sure we got some continuous photos so that we can actually monitor the site. So this was done without the trail cameras, and then we put the trail cameras in. So this was November 21, just after the work had finished. Still very raw, still a lot of settling in to do. And then this next set of pictures just shows the site, and you can see the gravel showing themselves really well, and the habitat's starting to settle down. So that's in April. And then same camera, it's been fixed position, so it's just taking continuous images over time, and we just swap the card over on a regular basis so that we can download the images and see the changes and see what wildlife's turning up. So this was middle of summer. This is end of the year, so you can start to see the vegetation really starting to settle in. So it's starting to properly naturalize and settle down into the stream it wants to be. But one of the things we hadn't seen up to this point was some seriously high flows, because obviously, as mentioned earlier, flow conditions are really critical on chalk streams, and obviously dependent on what the aquifer's recharge is like. So I was keen to see how it would look when we got full flows, because we wanted to test it and check that, where we'd put reinforcement in wasn't going to get blown out. And this was the first full sort of serious flow conditions we had in January 24. and needless to say, it coped really well. Landowner was really happy. The fishing club were really happy. So it was a real sort of good moment where we could then actually say to them, what about thinking bigger, thinking about the whole reach? And these two images are actually drawn up not by me. This is actually the landowner really grasping the potential. So the landowner had sat down himself working with us and actually said, well, this is what I'm thinking. This is where I think we should be phasing our work and where we can look at it. So it's actually turning it on its head and saying the landowner is now fully empowered and fully engaged in the process. And on the left-hand image, you'll see the dark blue section is the section we've just completed. And then if you look at the left-hand end of that image on the left-hand side, you'll see that former feature that I picked out right at the start of the talk. And that is the next phase we're actually actively looking at now. And this is actually this last winter, so only 3-4 months ago, this is actually started to be created. You'll see the dead straight channel running along the bottom of the image and the meandering, sinuous meandering channel, former channel, now being picked out in that landscape. And that's upstream from the previous work. So we now have a plan to restore this full reach on this landowner. And because of the work we've done with this landowner, 2 landowners upstream are also now fully engaged and talking to us about restoration on their straightened sections, which is just upstream of this straightened section. But it's been a long journey, and it's about going on that journey with the landowner and taking them through the steps. So thank you for listening.
Wow, I'm feeling very lucky to work with such a great bunch of people. Thank you so much to the 4 of you for doing your presentations and for keeping to time, which with so much to talk about was always going to be a struggle. I'm just going to share my screen very briefly, if I can find it, to tell you a little bit maybe about part of the reason for why we were hosting this webinar, which is to try and really help people across the whole Chalkstream community with their own river restoration projects. So we've heard some really inspiring sort of stories from our speakers about how they've delivered their projects, you know, how long term it is, how importance of building landowner relationships, but also about how the understanding of chalk streams is needed to come up with a sort of a design and a scheme that's going to look after itself in the future. So what we'd really like from you, if you're able to share, is to tell us a little bit more about what would be really helpful to you. And I've seen some of the Q&A has sort of already brought up some ideas about how to size channels and various other comments. But we'd really like to hear from you as to what you need to help you do the job and to help you embrace that ambition that our speakers have been talking about, is a long-term ambition of restoring our chalk streams. So I've written down a few things there about tell us in the chat. There's going to be a survey after the call as well, so you get another chance to tell us maybe about what you're thinking would be helpful for you and for the projects you're involved in. If you could tell us what existing guidance and tools you're using. I think we've started trying to look, and there's a few obvious sort of things that are out there, but we haven't found a huge amount. So if you have guidance or tools you're using that are really helpful, tell us about those. And we'd really also like to know about the projects that are happening right now. So I've made a MS Forms sort of questionnaire to collect some data about the projects from 2024. We're working alongside the River Restoration Centre, so I'm hoping the data we collect from this we can feed back to them for their larger inventory. But just for the purposes of our Chalk Streams group, we'd really like to see what sort of projects are happening out there. Where is that sort of ambitious delivery? Where are people making great progress? And I'm hoping to do a sort of an annual review for 2024 and be able to reflect far wider that huge amount of work that's happening. I know it's happening out there. People have been generous to show me around projects they're involved in. This picture, it's Rupert Kelton's project on Action for River Kennet on the Shelbourne. So I've been there, I've been to lots of places, but wouldn't it be great to better show that whole breadth of work that's going on across our Chalkstream network? So please tell us about your projects. And Emily, I'm afraid there's another poll. It's quite a quick one, but perhaps you could tell us about how you would like us to share that information with you. different things work for different people. I love getting out to see sites and having people tell me about what's been happening. So there's options there. Perhaps we could set up some sort of guided site visits. We've talked about developing maybe some short video clips of some of these case studies that people can watch at their leisure. Would you like more webinars like this? I've enjoyed it. I hope a lot of you have done too. I hesitate to suggest an annual event because that is quite a lot to organise, and the RRC obviously have their event. But would people like to get together some sort of event to face to share ideas and to network? Would you like training course? Or one thing we're thinking of developing is some sort of modular guidance for chalk streams where people can dip in and look at the sort of project they're doing and try and get some support about how other people have done it, and trying to build that community too, so that somebody in one area can pick up a phone to somebody in another area and say, I hear you've done this last year, could you help me, or can you give me some ideas? I know everybody's very busy, but I also know that people are really interested in helping others. And if you have any examples of natural chalk streams, how do we know what natural chalk streams should look like? There are so few of them. Perhaps you could tell us about those. So Emily, again, I don't know what I've done to my Zoom today, but I can't see the results of the survey. What are people sort of saying?
So over 100 people have done the poll, which is great. Lots of people looking for short webinars presenting current work and giving opportunity for discussion. So about 76% of choosing that. And an online modular guide to restoring chalk streams is also popular. And also local regional guided site visits. But there is others as well.
That's good. They sound like there's maybe easier things for me to help sort of facilitate. So just before I hand over to Charles, and I see there are some questions, which is fabulous. So I shall hand over to Charles to address those in a minute. But I think it's useful to know where we're going next with this. So the CaBA Chalk Streams group has a dedicated smaller group looking particularly at this. So they're working to see what we can collectively produce to help everybody. So at the moment, we're in a kind of information gathering phase. So we hope to have that complete and come back together as that small group in May to then decide where we're going to go next with this. So at any point, feel free to feed back in information about what you want. If you have ideas after the event, then it would be great to hear from you, and particularly if you could fill in that questionnaire, that would be fabulous. So at this stage, I'm going to hand over to Charles to cover any of the questions that have been raised and to bring the call to a close sometime before 11, which we should be on target to achieve. So I'll hand back to you, Charles. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alison. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David and John and Mike. That was really, really fascinating. We've just got a few minutes to look at some of the questions, so it's going to be a bit of a skip. I'm afraid we'll have to sort of be a little bit judicious in our time. So I'm going to mention first of all that Sarah Eglinton from the Norfolk Wildlife Trust has asked, and so this is a general question to everybody, but could you feed back to the Wildlife Trusts, I think, and perhaps Sarah in particular, because they're doing some work on what the most effective measures that could be put in place in the planning system to protect chalk streams. What would these be? For example, things like have them listed as an irreplaceable habitat, a requirement for a 50-metre no development buffer. Those are some of the examples. I think it would be in 8 minutes, we can't go further into that, but people on the call might have some thoughts about that, and the Wildlife Trust is doing some consultation in that direction, so that could be really useful. So a few questions caught my eye. Sarah Perry asked where it's possible, and I think Mike and John both addressed this, but people might be interested because, of course, some of the examples, you're sort of putting up examples of rivers where we've been lucky enough to remeander very large sections or recover riverbeds over long reaches, and that isn't always possible. Mike and John both spoke about the practical constraints that exist in the real landscape. So Sarah asked about this. Where it's possible to remove impoundments and address bed level, but not actually put the river back where it used to be, is that still worth doing? And my answer to that is, yes, it is. You have to work within the constraints of the site, but you normally can, if you think about it carefully, find ways of addressing those fundamental parameters of bed level and sinuosity within the constraints of a site, and that's very much worth doing. One David answered maybe I could go to David for this, is how to determine the bed level to floodplain ratio, the thing that I was going on about that's so important. And I know, David, you've answered this in the text, but it I think would be useful for everyone to hear some of the thoughts on this one.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, this is one that thankfully the past can actually help us with. John showed some wonderful paleo channels, as did Charles and as did Mike. Actually, there's more of them around than you might, and certainly I might have thought, despite all the water meadows, etc. The advantage of those is that they do, unless they've been dredged out of existence themselves at some point in the past, they do give you broadly the relative bed elevation to the floodplain surface, because you can find the old gravel beds. If they're pretty much undisturbed, you can get the widths and the depths as well, and of course the plan form. So they're really, really useful resources, but you have to just be a little cautious in interpreting them. What does it involve? It involves a bit of mapping and looking at LiDAR, and it involves going out in the field with a hand auger or hand corer and having a prod around. But you do need to be careful to note whether or not it's showing any features of having been channelized or dredged itself. But a lot of them haven't. So yeah, use the past in this sense to help scale your river. And then of course don't get too worried about whether or not it's 3.2 meters or 3.8 meters wide, because the river will sort itself out once you've given it the basic template of elevation and width and bank full depth. Could say more, but time is missing.
But well, especially depth, I think, David. My experience is, if the depth is okay, the lateral adjustment the river can do, it's the depth adjustment or the refilling of its bed that it has such trouble with, because as you know, and you've told me in the past, they don't have the material. One I might bring Mike in on this, because someone's asked a really interesting question. I know we've had a bit of experience of this in Norfolk. I bet Mike has in Wiltshire. The best ways to capture and attenuate sediment runoff. Mike, have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's going to be one of those "it depends" answers, isn't it? It really does depend where it's coming from, and how it's getting there. I mean, it's always best to start at the source. If if it's coming out of a field, so good examples we have on the River Nadder catchment. We've got a landscape there that's quite hilly, and the roads are incised into the landscape. So once the sediment comes out the fields and hits the roads, it's going in the river. There's nothing you can do about it because you can't make it go back uphill. So it's always best to try and address it at source. If sediment is coming out of fields, that farmer is losing a really valuable resource. Of course, there are things you can do along pathways, and looking at where that can be intercepted and put back. Sometimes, in some cases, if you can get it off a road, for example, like basic kind of grips that the council goes around digging to get water off roads, they can be really effective. But all of those require maintenance. Almost everything you do once you're on a sediment pathway is something you have to maintain, and that becomes really difficult because who's responsible for it? Quite often nobody wants to be responsible for it, and especially if it involves road, because it's essentially contaminated waste. So I would say always be really careful with what you propose, and think really long term about it. If it's something that's going to have to be maintained by someone going forward in perpetuity, it's not really a solution. Whereas things that can be done actually at the source normally are things that can be relatively permanent. They're changes to land management. Nothing. You can spend loads of money trying to address silt coming off an arable field and going down the road, or you can try and convince someone to change that arable field into reverting back to pasture, and the problem goes away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think, Mike, your point about maintenance it definitely echoes our experience in Norfolk, where we've put in features on the River Nar, attenuation features, but years on, the better designed of them are still working. The not so well designed are probably not, but all of them need maintenance, and that's rarely built into river restoration budgets. nor is monitoring, of course, a subject which is dear to David's heart. It's very, very hard to get monitoring into river restoration budgets, which is a great shame because we need to be measuring what we're doing. So we are bang on 12 o'clock sorry, 11 o'clock. And Alison asked me to be quite fierce with the end time. I'm sorry we haven't got to all of the questions, but I think there's an opportunity for some of us to answer questions by email. And thank you so much, Alison, for organising this, and for Emily and the Rivers Trust team, and Rebecca. I hope everyone's had an enjoyable and informative morning. I know that I have. It's been really, really interesting. This has been a really good sort of quick tour through some of these ideas. And as Alison has said, we want to go into this further. We want to basically develop this sort of interface and conversation and exchange of ideas with regards to river restoration to try and drive standards and drive ambition and so on and so forth. So I hope you've all had an enjoyable morning and hope to see you again sometime soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Charles, and thanks so much, everybody, again. I won't keep you much longer, but just to quickly mention that in the chat, I've left a link to the CaBA website where you can find out more about our upcoming CaBA webinars. But for now, I'll say thank you again to all of our panelists and goodbye, everybody, and I hope you all have a very nice rest of your day. Thank you very much.